Alrighty, well, thanks everybody for a really stimulating conference this far. I've really learned a lot, and yeah, it's been great for me to get out of the semester. In Regensburg, we're teaching until the middle of February or so yeah, pardon the absence of slides. So yeah, in my comments today, I want to try to summarize some of the core ideas of the paper and introduce some themes, talk a bit about sources. So roughly, I'm going to say a few words about the sources for this paper and maybe the challenge of integrating sources from the Middle East into the archives of the Cold War. I'll try to cover kind of three big themes from the paper and then address some questions that Cyrus offered, some of which are maybe not fully answered, but we can perhaps consider together. So just to start off with, in terms of sources for this paper, a lot of this work comes out of a book manuscript, which I've completed and is currently under review. And I have to say, when writing about the history of Islam, or more specifically the history of Islamism, something rather distinct in this paper, when I started off on this research agenda 5 or 6 years ago, I kind of assumed that it would be very difficult to find sources of, say, Islamist movements, memoirs, and so on. And over the past 5 or 6 years, I have to say that my initial skepticism was happily proven wrong. So while this paper doesn't sort of showcase the full range of primary sources that are out there, I really want to emphasize for folks who are able to read Arabic or Persian, there's just a vast ocean of memoirs out there, writings as well from figures like Anis Naqash, Ali Muhtashami-Pur, Jalaluddin Farsi, Munir Shafiq, Ali Akbar Veliati, the foreign minister of Iran, IRGC members like Mohsen Rafiq Doust, periodicals from Islamist parties like the Islamic Call Party. There's really, I would say, kind of a vast ocean of magazines, periodicals, and memoirs, both of sources written at the time and of autobiographical sources written afterwards. So a lot of what I'm trying to do in this paper is connect the rich secondary scholarship that already exists out there on the Cold War in books by people like Gilles Kepel and Olivier Bois with this kind of vast amount of primary sources that are out there, especially from Shia Islamist actors, the main focus of my current work, but also trying to integrate Saudi pan-Islamism into the story. So what are some of the themes and takeaways of this paper? I'll try to summarize what I think are kind of three themes in broadly chronological order. One is, I think I try to emphasize the pluralism or plurality of Islamist world-making projects. My chronology is, I think, a bit different from many of the authors here. I kind of start in 1958. I mean, there's a prehistory, of course, of figures like Hassan al-Banna. We can go even further to Jamaluddin al-Afghani, but I really start with 1958 as a crucial turning point in the development of Islamist ideologies. This is especially true for Shia actors, so there's a discussion here of the Islamic Call Party, founded in Najaf shortly after the 1958 Iraqi Revolution, which I see as this really decisive turning point where Shia intellectuals begin to grapple with how they can overcome or perhaps build alongside the traditional structures of the Marja'iyya, a ideological, Leninist-style political party. This connects with what Yoav was saying about Sayyid Qutb in the Sunni Egyptian context of Islamism as maybe the exception that proves the rule to thought and the Cold War. Islamism is, I think, something that definitely would not have emerged in the way it did without the Cold War, whereas other themes like liberalism or existentialism, these are maybe not fundamentally Cold War-driven processes. And yet, as I try to show in the chapter, throughout a lot of the 1950s and the 1960s, while Shia Islamist movements are very creative and are looking towards the decolonizing Third World as a site of political contestation and political models, it is actually the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that proves to be the most effective globalizer of Islam during the 1960s. In sort of most provocative form, we might say that it's King Faisal and Lyndon Johnson who were the leaders of the Global South during the 1960s. 1960s in this sense, building connections with Pakistan, with Indonesia, with South Korea, with Taiwan, with Japan, the military dictatorship in Brazil, to forge a kind of reactionary international with the Saudi-Pakistan axis as the core of this. And if you kind of accept this line of argument, then I think one interesting narrative challenge is different chronological points suggest themselves. 67 is, of course, central, but what about 1971, the breakup of Pakistan, student movements in Bangladesh leading to a new post-colonial Muslim state at odds with Pakistan, formerly the kind of paladin of Muslim global interests in the Saudi world-making project. A second theme that I discuss is the kind of transformations of Shi'ism and Shia Islamism in the 1970s. Where Shia Islamists could write a lot about decolonization, and figures like Hadi Khosrow Shahi would travel around the world or write articles about Muslim minorities in sub-Saharan Africa. I argue that it's not until the 1970s that Shia Islamist activists have access to the terrains that will prove so decisive for the transformation of Shia Islamism. And here a lot of what Yoav said, I think, laid the groundwork for what I write about. This happens through the revolution in Syria. This happens through the overthrow of King Idris in Libya, and the emergence of Gaddafi as a supplier of weapons and also ideas for Islamist actors like Mohammed Montazeri or Jalaluddin Farsi. And it, of course, happens through exchanges in the Palestinian camps in southern Lebanon. And I think in the story I tell, if we really track the terrains where these guys are coming into contact with new ideas, this can help us have a more skeptical eye towards claims of authenticity that are later made by the Islamic Republic after 1979. I think it's really a common tendency to take Islamists at face value when they claim that they are being authentic or returning to the roots, having a return to the self, to use the phrase of Ali Shariati. And yet, as I try to hint at in this paper, if you look at a lot of the key slogans of the Islamic Republic after 79, where do they actually come from? Neither east nor west. Well, this was a Libyan slogan from the early 1970s. Export of the revolution is an Egyptian slogan from like 1970s. The idea that the path to Jerusalem goes through Karbala, this is something the Egyptians talked about in their war in Yemen, the path to Jerusalem going through Sana'a in the 1960s as well. When there's a Ministry of Islamic Guidance in the Islamic Republic, in many ways patterned on an Egyptian Ministry of National Guidance from the previous period. So I try to emphasize how the Islamic Revolution and Islamism, while it clearly has many kind of authentically Shia components to it, would in many ways not pass the plagiarism test, so to speak, if you compared it to Libya and Egyptian projects of mass politics and revolution from the 1960s and early 1970s. And I don't think this is a surprise if you look at where people like Montazeri or Farsi or many of their mentors came from, Nakash as well. So I think maybe the third theme that comes out here, and maybe the one that I'm least certain about, is the theme of endings. I would argue that while the Cold War played a decisive role in putting Islamism on the agenda and kind of creating Islamism, this end of the Cold War in the Middle East leads to a kind of sectarian geography after 1979. I try to emphasize in the paper how the Islamic Revolution in Iran is very threatening to Arab regimes precisely because it combines these themes of mass politics and Shi'ism, obviously threatening to regimes like Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And I try to highlight how Saudi Arabia, in partnership with the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, turns to themes of kind of Sunni chauvinism, of Sunni supremacism, a kind of tribal Arab consciousness as an alternative to the mass politics, Palestinian-infused Shi'ism on offer in Iran during this period. And so I think this is one question we might think about of transitions and endings. 1982 was a moment where the problematic and fraught Iranian-Palestinian relationship really frays, and Tehran, of course, turns to Shia groups in Lebanon as its preferred interlocutors under the kind of aegis of Syrian supervision. So this theme of kind of a transition from a Cold War world to a sectarian world is something that I try to strongly emphasize in the paper. I have many anecdotes here that I'd like to share from my research, but I'll try to, I'll contain myself for now and move on to some of the ending thematic themes in the spirit of keeping it sort of sportlich this morning. So a couple of open questions that I think the paper leaves unaddressed or perhaps open for discussion. This is very much a paper about Islamism. And in a lot of my writing and methodology, I'm inspired by historians like Niall Green, who talk about the many and the few. Most kind of conventional believing Muslims maybe didn't care about these ideas. The projects I write about were projects and ideas that were pushed by exiles, by dissidents, people unwanted in their home countries. But this is a story very much of how even kind of lunatics and madmen and exiles, when paired up with foreign capital, foreign resources, and foreign ideas, can kind of move and change the context of the many. So this kind of theme of a small group of people with determined ideas and foreign backing being able to change things is a core idea here. Secondly, though, and maybe turning towards kind of holes in the argument or issues in the paper, I think an open question is how the Cold War polarizes Islamist scenes or just Islam more broadly in different countries. And I think here Turkey is the most interesting example. And here I think there's rich possibilities for dialogue with Perrine. So in Iran, one of the interesting things is Iran is, of course, an American client state. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that many of these Iranian Islamists turn out to be very anti-American. Turkey, also an American client state during the Cold War, but it seems to me that Turkish Islamism gets polarized in a kind of different, more right-wing direction due to endogenous factors in Turkey. Probably the most famous episode of this is in 1969 when the Sixth Fleet, I believe, visits Istanbul. There are large leftist student protests, and the Islamists come out with baseball bats and 2x4s to teach these dirty communists a lesson, basically. And we get the polarization of Turkish politics between left and right in the 1970s. But even looking further, and while I'm not an expert on Turkish Islamism, I've learned from the readings that I have had access to that Turkish Islamism, rather than going in this third worldist, Palestinian-inflected, more revolutionary direction, thinkers like a guy, Kisukurek, emphasize racial purity, the supremacy of the Turks as vessels for Islam in a post- and sort of a post-Abbasid or post-Arab-led world, emphasize the supremacy of the Turkish race over Kurds and other non-Turks in the region. And so Turkish Islamism can kind of go in this more nationalist, racial supremacist direction as opposed to a more egalitarian, flattening, third worldist affect as we get in Iran. Likewise, research that I've encountered or am supervising on Muslims in Yugoslavia kind of highlights this dimension of how the Cold War or the national politics of your country can kind of inflect the direction that the Islamic or Islamist scene goes in. In Yugoslavia, the Islamic community, the Islamska zajednica, gets enlisted in the project of non-alignment as an interlocutor between the Tito regime and governments in MENA. I have a great PhD student, George Loftus, who's writing very much on this dynamic and shows how Yugoslavia mobilizes and encapsulates its own Muslim community to use it as a tool of diplomacy in ways similar to the way the Soviet Union does. So the last thing I would highlight, we touched on this a bit also in Yoav's presentation with the idea of the engagé intellectual and activism. One question that Cyrus posed to me when I think reading the abstract for this was the issue of categories and the need to be specific or adopt a rich vocabulary. I think a potential problem with this paper is the use of the term activist, which can mean anything. I feel like now as we've entered the Trump 2.0 era, you see a lot of social media accounts that will say, father, historian, coffee lover, activist. And it's kind of like, what does that really mean exactly? What are we talking about when we say that somebody is an activist? You don't get a pension for being an activist. You don't have to have a certificate to be an activist. What does this really mean? And so I think if there's kind of room for added conceptual or methodological sophistication in the paper, it's about specifying the categories that we use to describe people. Is Khomeini an activist? When does he start and stop to be one? Is there a richer vocabulary that we might use for this? And so these are just things I would like to pose as open questions as we try to revise these papers. I think I have 15 seconds left, so I'll bow out, hopefully ahead of time, and turn over to Jeremy.
A few things before I start. I want to thank Cyrus and the Du Bois Foundation and the students and staff who've done such a wonderful, seamless job on every aspect of the conference. I know how much work that can be, and I really appreciate it. I think we all really appreciate it. I'm going to talk about a topic we haven't talked about yet: the Arab-Israeli conflict. That's a joke. I also want to say that there's so much heat today when I or others give talks in public about the Arab-Israeli conflict and Israel-Palestine that I want to admit to you that I'm wrong. So we can get over that in the when we get to the Q&A and get to the substance. It's interesting to me, Tim. Just for whatever reason, Tim was first on the program, and I like it because there's like this reverse chronological thing as the Arab-Israeli conflict is kind of crashing out of the Cold War, and I think it was LORENZ's fourth phase is 1975 to 84, the end of the Cold War. The political Islam in 1979, and comes to rescue the importance of this all. So the first point I wanted to make was that, and I think this cuts through a lot of the papers, and we've talked about this in so many ways, is that the Arab-Israeli conflict has its own agency. Just the obvious point, the Arab-Israeli conflict existed before the Cold War, whether you want to say 1881 or 1913 or whatever, and it sadly continues to exist and after. But to move sort of beyond that generality, I wanted to say three things I'm thinking about when I say that the Arab-Israeli conflict has its own agency. First, that domestic politics shaped many of the Arab-Israeli conflict events, right? And again, that's come out in many of the papers. I was thinking about the 1956 example, the way in which the free officers changed the trajectory of Egyptian policy, the way, not quite simultaneously, but from a broad historical perspective, simultaneously, the Israeli leadership is changing, and the struggle between Ben-Gurion and the activists, the militants, and Moshe Sharet, who's briefly prime minister, who has a more restrained, or maybe would have had a more restrained policy, but is first pushed aside as prime minister and then leaves as foreign minister, and how crucial those are to what happens in 1956. And I think we could tell, and some of you have told a similar story about 67 or many other moments of those domestic machinations. Secondly, in thinking about the conflict having its own agency, we often talk about how the U.S. and Soviets are using the actors to achieve different goals, but the local actors are also using the U.S. and Soviets to achieve their own political and military needs, and that also comes with certain expectations of support. I'm going to come to Egypt a lot at the end of my talk, but part of that expulsion of the advisors and the whole early 70s shift, I mean, I think there's fundamental reasons why Egypt is doing that for economic and strategic reasons, but there's also, I think, that lingering disappointment that the Soviets weren't there forcefully enough in 67 and were restraining Egypt in the early 70s as Egypt was trying to rectify this tear in its territorial sovereignty. So the need to fight wars, the need to fight wars, I don't want to say that. The desire or the occurrence of fighting wars necessitates getting resources from external parties, especially if your adversaries are getting resources from external parties. And I think it was Guy's paper mentioned the 22 million that in 1948 Israel got through the other Czech arms deal that we don't talk about as much, or, the billions that the U.S. and really the Soviets with the 55 Czech arms deal, and into the 60s, the billions that are sending and the U.S. is sending, and the role that arms transfers plays. And of course, it's a market thing for the U.S. and the Soviets too, but it's vital for countries to be able to fight that war, to have those capabilities. And then the third point about agency is that local actors feel empowered, which I guess is kind of the definition of agency, so maybe I'm just saying what I already said, but when they want to disregard the advice of Moscow or of Washington, they do. And I know I have a difference of opinion maybe with some of you about what happens between the U.S. and Israel before 1967, but I think the U.S., and I've written this, was trying pretty hard to restrain the Israelis by creating an alternative, a maritime flotilla. The U.S. eventually gives up because the flotilla is not going to work, and maybe because they realize the Israelis don't care and are going to make certain choices. But the Israelis are willing to disregard this U.S. Pressure, and again, we see that on the Soviet-Egyptian relationship as well. And it goes beyond just individual decisions, right? I think pointing to Egypt in the early 1970s, when my national needs change, I'm willing to change horses, right? I'm going to just flip the script here, and suddenly I'm in the U.S. camp after a few years. And so I think that's important. I next want to turn more directly to the Soviet Union and the United States. If to them the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I'm sure there's many ways to understand it, but if to them the Arab-Israeli conflict is about an arena for great power searching for allies and places to sell arms or subsidize arms, first, let me just quickly say a few words about the search, right, which is sort of I'll start with a very basic point. However unequal in capabilities that the two powers are, and we talked about this a lot yesterday, both powers are engaging in this search for allies. Secondly, just in sort of simple points, we've heard several options over the last couple days about why they're engaged in that search. And that's not really my purpose here, but I at least want to flag what a number of you others have written about those purposes. It's about oil, or it's about containment, anti-containment, U.S. hegemony. It's about gender, race, and class. It's about markets, right? So I'm not focused on I'm on the intermediate step of, okay, given there's these various explanations and fights we can have about what the goals were for this search, I'm focused on the search once it's commenced. And I just want to note before making 2 points, sort of broader points about this search that the superpowers are engaged in for allies, that this search is also happening, and this sort of circles back to some of what I said at the beginning, as those potential allies are in flux, right? So it's not, you haven't agreed to play a game, and then we all have a monopoly board in front of us, and it's just a static board, right? The board on which the U.S. and Soviets are trying to do this is in flux. The examples I gave about Egypt and Israel in the mid-1950s, the leadership changes going on. Syria of the 1950s and 1960s, I think, would be another example. That things like, it's not that each of these is not true in every case, but things like leaders and what the identity of the state is and political systems are in flux in many of these situations. And so the choices that they're making, it's like there's a moving, I shouldn't say target, but there's a moving target as the states are doing this. So given those general points about the search, I wanted to make two points specific to one's to the U.S. and one's to both powers. And the first one has come up before, that the U.S. faces a dilemma, that the alliance with Israel, which I've argued really starts to crystallize in the early 1960s with the Hawk sales and the Kennedy administration, that there's this obvious problem that may lead to the alienation and the inability to rely and build relationships with Arab states. And part of, I think, part of what happens in the periodization of the Cold War is the U.S. I'm not saying it's an explicit experiment, but the U.S. experimenting with different ways of addressing that dilemma of how do you stay close to Israel or build closer and closer to Israel and still engage with the Arab world. And so early in the Cold War, the U.S. kind of tries to stay at a distance. There's other reasons too, right? Maybe maybe because you think the British are going to take it, whatever. But then you see like a Kennedy administration approach trying to work with both, right? You get the arms sale to Israel, you start to see deeper relations with Israel, but you also see the outreach with Nasser. Right, and so maybe trying to play both sides. And then ultimately we see a very clear U.S. decision post-67, but I would say especially post-1970, 1973, that no, we're just going to choose sides. Whoever from the Arab national side still will talk to us, fine, but we're going to choose the Israeli side very clearly by then. And I should note, clearly this is not like an all or nothing dichotomy, right, because the U.S. is maintaining relations with Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, to some extent at other times, including arms sales. The other point I want to make is that what we ultimately see, and I think the search for allies and the relationship with allies reflects that, is the U.S. ascendance and the Soviet marginalization in the region, which we've talked about. Again, I think it's another way of what does it mean when LORENZ says the end of the Cold War from 1975. Maybe, riffing on Osama's paper, maybe this was preordained given the massive disparity in goals and capabilities. But certainly if we look at the Soviet role in the 1967 and 1973 wars and then compare that to the Soviet role in the 1982 war, we see a very diminished effort on the part of the Soviet Union. Lastly, just to try and bring together or reflect a little bit on everything I've said so far, I want to talk about two last things. One is this the peace process, and the other is just a particular comment about Egypt in the early 1970s, which I've suggested already, but I just maybe want to crystallize a little more. The peace process, then, is really doing double work for the United States. Right, the peace process, which really I'm thinking of especially the post-1973 version of it, even though we know there's elements of it before that. So first, it's resolving this U.S. It's an effort to resolve this U.S. dilemma of what do we do if we're close to Israel and we alienate Arab parties? Because the idea is that the explicit belief of some officials, we can shut down the conflict, then this dilemma goes away. It evaporates. And I think, like even today, I think when Trump comes into office and is talking about Israeli-Saudi normalization, I think we hear echoes, at least, of that same idea. We can make it all kind of come together if we just use diplomacy to get all the parties to like each other. But the peace process is also, as scholars have written, marginalizing the Soviets, right? And the way that the U.S. and Kissinger conducts the process is about pushing the Soviets out, and it works. In my own work, I do some research on how, and I talk about this briefly in the paper, about how the Camp David process, and maybe here I disagree with some others, makes a substantive effort at resolving this dilemma. Right, that the way in which the Carter administration opens up to the Palestinians genuinely as a national political movement is fundamentally different than most other U.S. administrations. It's not embraced in the same way by subsequent administrations for a while, or maybe ever, but certainly for a while. And that the way in which both Carter officials and Egyptian negotiators approached the autonomy talks in 1979 that flow from Camp David is also with ideas that are a substantive push towards accepting Palestinian nationalism. They fail, and the Israeli negotiators prevail. But the ideas that they're putting on the table, based on the U.S. record of those autonomy talks, suggest that they took the idea seriously. And then lastly, just to close on the question of kind of local agency, I want to just bring together a little bit, thinking about Egypt as just a real exemplar of this moment, and we could choose different moments to do that. I want to talk about the early maybe the 1970s, I won't say the early 1970s, that I think someone noted yesterday that Egypt was never happy being, they felt like they got second fiddle when they had to ally with the Soviets to counter the West, French and U.S. support for Israel. So maybe that's kind of the backdrop anyway, like maybe they never liked it, but the 1972 expulsion of Soviet advisors, which, just to remind ourselves, was just 2 years after if I can be a little crass, just, the Soviets in some ways saved Egypt's ass in the war of attrition. And then like 2 years later, it's like, okay, we're actually, thank you, we're heading in a different direction. But more substantively after the October War. right, when Egypt fully engages in a U.S. exclusive shuttle diplomacy and a full turn to Washington. And I want to mention, I guess this is why it's not just the early 1970s, I want to mention also 1977. And the part of it maybe we don't often talk about as much, which is Carter kind of, I'm jokingly saying, he kind of forgets that now the U.S. has excluded the Soviets, right? Because if you remember, Carter comes in talking about a comprehensive deal. I should mention Geneva, right? We're in Geneva. And then, if I'm getting my date right, October 1st, 1977, the U.S. and the Soviets come out with a joint communique, and which is kind of the opposite of the notion of freezing out of the Soviet Union. And it's met with incredible opposition from the U.S. foreign policy establishment, but also from Egypt. Just weeks later, Sadat throws cold water on it by announcing that he's willing to go to the Knesset in Jerusalem and go on a very bilateral approach rather than a comprehensive multilateral approach. So I guess my point here is just as we think about these events of the 1970s, had Egypt liked being a Soviet ally, had Egypt thought that being a Soviet ally was the best way to advance Egypt's economic and strategic national interests, right? The whole way in which we talk about the Cold War in the Middle East ending, maybe we wouldn't be talking about that. Maybe there'd be an alternative history somewhere in the multiverse, right? Egypt the Cold War continued into the 1980s because Egypt stuck with the Soviets, and we still had the parallel dichotomy at both the superpower and at the regional local level. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
I'll do the Turkey thing. I'm committed. Yeah, that's such an interesting question. So I have a forthcoming book, inshallah, on the history of comparisons between Turkey and Iran. And this question of the hope for a pro-American Islam is so much at the center of the development of various political Islams. And I think, so comment and a question. Okay, my comment is, you're right about Kısakürek, and also I would think about the role of Nursi here, right? And then that line from Nursi to Fethullah Gülen of extremely pro-American Islam, and Kısakürek, as you know, he talks about how we should be America's coy lovers, gender, sexuality, literally that's the language he uses, Nazlı Sevgili. In our collaboration with America, we should be coy lovers. So, don't put out too much. That's literally, okay, that's an Islamist guy, to ask for more things, almost like the Shah, right? So be more coy, and then obviously we go into the Fethullah Gülen, very, very pro-American, and a lot of the history of anti-Semitism of Fethullah Gülen's older comments are erased as he also becomes kind of a ally for Zionism. So I think that trajectory is really interesting. And my question is, there's been, I read here and there that there is a potential trajectory similar to that in Iran, especially during the coup, as the United States kind of tries to reach out to religious actors, and even as the revolution is happening, they're oh, maybe Khomeini, maybe he's okay, he's going to be anti-communist. They have, United States still in some ways holds on to this idea that Islam, there's something in it, it's kind of pro-American in some ways. And then again, going back to Turkey, in the 70s, when you have Necmettin Erbakan, his movement is much more third worldist and much more not wanting to join the European Union, much more interested in sort of large-scale industrialization. And then we move from him to Erdogan, who again becomes the darling of sort of pro-American vision. Sorry, Mike. The question is, do you find that vision of a pro-American Islam in the Iranian context as well, or is there really a sharp divide?
Thank you both. Really great papers again. Tim, wonderful paper. Can I just pick up on your starting point, your 1958? And I suppose it's the old chestnut about the North African dimension. I suppose my question is really about Islamism and Arabization projects, particularly as pursued within kind of nation-making, insurgent movements, whatever you want to describe them, that are desperately trying to pull in ulama-based, effectively Islamist, often Muslim Brotherhood-aligned groups across North Africa. And I just wonder if there is space in your sort of approach for that, or whether you think that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, thanks for fascinating papers. I really enjoyed the presentations and reading them. In the interest of the sort of broader topic of the conference, I was wondering where you see these papers coming together and in conversation with each other. In other words, how you see the stories of Islam and Islamism coming together with the Arab-Israeli conflict in the Cold War context.
So we take these three and then go on next. Just keep it.
I'm keeping it.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll maybe start with Preen and Martin's questions, and I think Chris's question kind of intersects. I have to admit there's a lot of room for education on my part with the history of Turkish Islamism, but in terms of sources, one thing I can say, especially to graduate students or anybody who, enjoys learning foreign languages, is actually the Turkish kind of Islamist source base is among the richest and the most easily accessible. There's a huge project, I don't know which institution sponsored it, but essentially most of the major and most important Turkish Islamist periodicals from the roughly 1950s onwards have been digitized. So, we talked earlier about men in pajamas. Well, I think in the comfort of your own pajamas, it's very easy to just access these sources. A lot of Afghan periodicals are also digitized. But turning to the content of your question, Perrine, is there a possibility for an American Islam in the Iranian context? I think the short answer is no. As I show in the paper, there's this search for potential replacements for Mossadegh from in the early 1950s among the U.S. and the anti-communism is so strong that the kind of pro-Nazi or pro-German past of figures, whether Zahedi or Kashani, is really dismissed. This is not a red flag because just finding a reliable anti-communist paladin in Iran is of utmost priority. So I think this then shapes the vocabulary and the outlook of Iranian Islamists in contrasts to the kind of more pro-American bent of the Turkish example. I think during the pandemic, when I gave a conference here, I started off with a book produced by the Islamic Republican Party of, I think it was called like Mofahim-e-Siyasi. It was kind of a basic political vocabulary for cadre in the Islamic Republic Party. And they have an entry on American Islam as something that needs to be avoided and that the Islamic Republic will sort of steadfastly confront. So I think Iranian Islamists were aware of American Islam as something that Saudi was doing, something that Iraq, in their view, was kind of pushing alongside Baathism, and that they were absolutely against. For Martin, I have to admit this is that the NA here is maybe a bit above my pay grade. I don't have a good answer to your question, but would only admit that this is maybe a good example of how the perspective that we think of the three blind men and the elephant, the perspective that we approach it from provides certain insights, but also certain blind spots. For me, I was talking about this, I think with somebody this morning, I come to this topic sort of by way of Afghanistan and Iran, and I think that offers certain advantages. For an Afghan Islamist whose main concern is a racist, Pashtun supremacist monarchy, Arab-Israeli conflict is certainly on the radar, but whether or not Egypt or Israel wins doesn't really change the composition of the Afghan state and racism against Hazara or Shia within it. Conversely, though, that means that the Algerian or Tunisian or Moroccan or whatever dimension is necessarily going to fall to the wayside, let's say. But here I'll defer to Cyrus's recommendations about further networking, and I'm in the process of reading your book, so I continue the educational process along with the Turkish dimension.
So Chris, on your question, a few scattered thoughts. First, I just observed the reverse of the joke I tried to make at the beginning, which is that the conflict is the touchstone for almost every paper that's been here. I don't mean that it dominates every paper. I don't mean to be reductionist in that way, but there's some reference in almost every paper to some seminal event that was an Arab-Israeli conflict event, usually 56, 67, 73, but we have other choices too. And by the way, the fact that I can just say 56, 67, 73, and that's like the code. The second piece, I guess my problem in answering your question is I'm having trouble doing the triangle. And what I mean by that is, like, I can think a lot about Islam and the Arab-Israeli conflict, but I'm having trouble Islam, Arab-Israeli conflict, Cold War. And I think you'll see that in the rest of my response. And so I'd welcome if smarter people have a more innovative way to think about that. So the 1980s, which is this like dead period in some ways from everything I've been emphasizing, is the period where, maybe not surprisingly, there's a lot of intersection between Islamism and the Arab-Israeli conflict. And just to throw out some of the most obvious ways, the role that Iran takes up as leading an anti-Israeli coalition, which builds over time, but the connection to Hezbollah and the building of Hezbollah and the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And the way that the fall of the Shah and the change of regime of government and system in Iran reconfigures both the U.S. alliance structure and projection of power in the region, and also affects the Israeli sense of, like, who are potential allies in the role that the Shah's Iran had played, and facilitating. I don't know if that's the right word, but facilitating the entry of the United States, of CENTCOM, in a very explicit Gulf way, that eventually, post-Cold War especially, but already by the first Persian Gulf War of 1991, but certainly like in the last 15 months we've seen that U.S. presence then comes to be used directly to intervene in the Arab-Israeli conflict. In 91 it did with the Scud missiles towards Israel from Iraq, and more explicitly now with some of the attacks on Israel from other members of the Iranian coalition. And then the other piece that, again, now I'm straying far afield, I think, from the Cold War, is just to think about the sense in which the Israeli national security establishment saw early on political Islam as a potential counterweight to Palestinian Arab nationalism. And, we know where that story led from the 1970s to more recent years. But trying to weave all those last few points into the Cold War, too, I'm not sure I have the vocabulary or idea for that.
Yes, thank you. I have a quick question for team. I'm trying to figure out the kind of Saudi Arabia in the context of this conference. So it's, of course, comes in the context of oil, and probably Chris is going to say more about that in his panel. But there's also something around the internationalization of Islam, and kind of its reconfiguration domestically. and it is known in some of the literature as petro-Islam. I wonder what you think of that. Where do you see this like if it makes sense to you, this petro-Islam is usually when you put two things together, it needs to inform the petro and it needs to inform Islam to become petro-Islam. I'm not sure how exactly it works, but I wonder if you can make any sense of that.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Vasily Klementov, University of Zurich. I had a question for Tim. It goes back a bit to your starting point about the rise of Islamists and the Shia-Sunni split. And I have always kind of a trouble of reconciling the two to some extent. So I always kind of think to which extent the split is kind of prominent in the thinking of the different actors. For example, to which extent it's prominent for the Iranians as they see it as an example for others. To which extent the Sunni Islamists in Afghanistan, for example, think also in terms of the split, or to which extent Saudi Arabia sees Iran as a model, people in Saudi Arabia could see Iran as a model despite the split. For example, I know that in Pakistan in the early 80s, and at the time of Ziaul Haq, there is thinking that you could have some kind of like an axis stretching from Pakistan to Iran to Turkey. And then he pitches that to the Americans when they come to talk about that. So it's unclear to which extent they actually downplay it, or it's starting to build up as something which is important. Thank you.
Let's take just these two and then go on.
Yeah, thanks. For petro-Islam and Yoav's question, in most of the memoirs and the sources that I use, the competition with Saudi is something that is on the consciousness of Iranian Shia Islamists from the 60s and 70s onwards. But I would say that their main gripes against the Saudi regime are less centered around international political economy and on other issues. Two instances that come to mind is one in 1969, a Australian evangelical Christian attempts to burn down the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's a major incident, of course, and from the memoirs of figures like Mohtasham Pur, the later ambassador to Damascus, we know that after this incident, both Saudi, through the OIC, but also figures like Musa Sadr, the Iranian Lebanese cleric, make a kind of moderate appeal, if you will, saying, well, this is this horrible thing, look at what this kind of American-inspired evangelical religious extremism is doing to the region. We should try to rebuild or repair this part of Al-Aqsa. At this moment, then Khomeini makes one of his first kind of international announcements and says, no, we should leave the mosque kind of wounded. We should leave it broken as a reminder of this kind of wound that has been inflicted to us. And so I think starting in the late 60s, you see this criticism of Saudi not through the lens of oil or political economy, but as pseudo-Islamic, right? That it fights Islam in the name of Islam, as I think using as somebody from the Dawa party already writes in the late 1950s. Then later, you get Iranian activists, again to use that fraught word, abusing Hajj tourism as a way to criticize and expose Saudi Arabia. Figures like Marzieh Hadice, a prominent female activist, again to use the word, goes along with Mohammad Montazeri to the Hajj, I think in 1972 or 1973, and wants to hold up posters saying not only down with America or down with Zionism, but also liberate Kaaba, or Saudi is too close with America, or so on, trying to convince other pilgrims of Saudi's reactionary nature. And of course, they get their signs confiscated. The Hajj police give them a hard time, and so on. So I think it's more through these lenses of kind of Saudi's duplicitous claims to lead the Muslim world and the ways in which it refuses to allow the Hajj to become a incubator for a kind of global Muslim consciousness, let's say, that are on the top of their gripes. Later in the 1980s, I've encountered many Iranian periodicals that will criticize this, especially given the ups and downs of the oil market in the 1980s. So it's partly a question of when your question is posed, but for the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, it's along along these other lines. And then secondly, for Vasily, about for whom is the split salient and when and why, this is a great question. I think it's worth emphasizing, and one of the things I was most surprised by the deeper that I dug into, especially Islamic Cult Party or Dawa Party periodicals and writings, is that they were big fans of Sayyid Qutb. They had no problem with Qutb being seen as a inspiration for Salafis or others. They loved Qutb. They love Maududi. They very much saw themselves as bringing on board a kind of universalist tradition of Muslim Brotherhood thought that could be very fruitfully integrated with Shia thought and tradition. A good example is the Islamic Cult Party. You did not have to be Shia to join it. You could be, you just had to be a Muslim. Over time, though, I think that Shia and Iranian actors become aware of how sectarianism is being used to divide them. The Islamic Republic sponsors this foundation for reconciliation or Taghrib between the two sects to kind of highlight commonalities between the different sects. And so there's an awareness, I think, especially after 79 or the Iraqi invasion, that this is something that they have to put more on the agenda. It's definitely more salient, I think, for Saudi, Iraqi, and Sunni actors. So this is very much an asymmetrical understanding, I would say. A good example and anecdote I wanted to mention earlier is when a Kuwaiti, again, activist, journalist, I need better nouns here, Abdullah Nafisi, goes to Tehran sometime in the late 1980s or early 1990s, so later. He later describes in an interview going to Iran and says, well, my taxi driver took me around and showed me that there are Armenian churches. So there's a thriving Christian community in Tehran. He goes and shows me that there are synagogues that still operate in the Islamic Republic. And then Nafisi says, I want to go to a mosque. Where is a proper Sunni mosque? And he claims that, I cannot find a really proper Sunni mosque where I can pray in the Hanifi fashion. I'm looking for this, and the Iranians are trying to convince me, no, there's just one kind of system of mosques for all Muslims in this spirit of kind of unity. And Nafisi later remarks with frustration of how he has to go to, I think, the Kuwaiti or some Arab embassy in order to find a place to properly do this as evidence that Iran is in fact this claims to be Islamic, but it again is pro-Christian, pro-Jewish, is anything but. So you have kind of a lot of people offering these kind of galaxy brain takes, if you like, in their effort to discredit one another as sectarian in the 1980s and onwards.
Do you have one afterwards as well?
Yeah, sure. So thank you guys both for really, really fascinating papers. I noticed I was thinking about in Yoav's presentation prior, he talks, this is more for you, Tim, he talks about political Islam as being able to be read as, through a kind of leftist vocabulary and lens. And you talk a little bit more about the sort of like the institutions having much more, sort of coming through a local, looking at other Islamist groups throughout the region. So I guess I see this as not necessarily a contradiction, but a sort of a tension, that there's sort of both of these realities at the same time. And it reminds me of how when I broach this subject often with undergraduates, right? Their first sort of reaction is like, well, Islam and Marxism don't go together. One's atheist, one's a religion. So I guess I don't have a really specific question. I would just like to hear your take as someone who's read a lot about this from the perspective of the sources. What do you make of this tension? How would you maybe explain that issue to someone? Because I would love some help explaining it to my undergrads when they ask me.
So one question for each of you. Let me start with Tim. So you invoked Nile Green's The Few and the Many, right, I think. What happens when we look not so much at the few, but more also a little bit more at the many? Let me just, venture, and here's my question. So certainly, I think from the 40s onwards, the United States government and some religious actors, related to it, tried to make the point around the world more and more that the US is, for anybody who is religious, basically better a reference point than the Soviet Union, precisely for what you just said. How did the many perceive this? This is a soft power move, but it was on the government side, it was a soft power move, but of course, US religious activists, to use that word again, like missionaries, of course, had their own agenda, so that also complicated things. But the US government also really did certain things. So I think at some point in the 50s, there was some problem with airplanes, like going to Mecca, and I think then the US stepped in big time. I think this maybe was in 52, 53, and they literally flew in, I think, 6,000, 7,000, I think mainly Turkish pilgrims, like via Beirut to Mecca. So, things of this sort. But also, like in Iran, like people like Bourdieu, for instance, I don't think he was necessarily super anti-American. And this sort of move to more anti-American, mujtahids happened, principally in the 60s. And even then, Khomeini was still like one among a few. A lot of people were still following other mujtahids, right? So how does this play out, but also on the Soviet side, because the Soviets had to react to this, and they did, in all sort of really complicated ways as well. So this is one question. I should maybe say that this may mean, if this may become a part of the chapter, right? This might be a very interesting way of showing how the bottom-up and the top-down view of the Cold War can actually very often come together, because this would be an exact, a point here. And for Jeremy, okay, let's go back first to Osama's sort of take, right? Which is that this is not ultimately at all a confrontation between equals. The United States is much more powerful, which bottom line I very much agree with. Then you say, well, in the Arab-Israeli conflicts, states and then later on also movements need arms. Where do they get these arms from? Very few produce them at home. They mainly get them from abroad. Is the Arab-Israeli conflict precisely for this reason maybe a field where the Soviets actually play a much greater role? Because they can and they have to, not they have to, but they can and they're willing to give all these weapons, right? So if this is true, could we maybe look at these two different macro perspectives on what the Cold War was, namely a confrontation, more not quite between equals, but one where both superpowers really were at it, versus one where one superpower very, very clearly is has primacy, as you put it. Can we maybe not look at these two perspectives as totally separate, but as being on a line of continuity, where in certain fields the primacy is much clearer, while in other fields it's really pretty much a confrontation of equals, and made this case, your case, that aspect of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which of course is much bigger than simply a bunch of wars, but arms and wars play an important part, right? Does this aspect of the Arab-Israeli conflict relate to a broader perspective of the global Cold War, where the Soviet Union is actually pretty much an equal rival, an equal partner, as it were?
Thanks for a lot of very rich questions. I'll start with, I think it was Bill's question about, how can one reconcile the kind of leftist or third worldist affect with the kind of Muslim Brotherhood legacy? I think the way I would answer this is to say that if you look at the early years of the Islamic Republic and actors in it, part of my account stresses these encounters between figures like Anis Nakash, Munir Shafiq, both of whom have pasts in like the student brigade and Palestinian leftist or Maoist politics before converting to Islam, and then Iranian actors like Jalaluddin Farsi, Mohammad Saleh al-Husseini, who's kind of largely unknown in the literature, but is this really important half Iraqi, half Iranian guy, Mohammad Montazeri. These are all the figures who were involved in this kind of so-called pro-Libyan, more internationalist faction under the aegis of Ayatollah Montazeri in the early Islamic Republic. And, characteristically, when they set up the IRGC, their first nominee to head the IRGC is not even Iranian. It's Ahmad al-Khatib, this kind of, I believe, Sunni Lebanese military officer who spearheaded the dissolution of the Lebanese army during the early civil war. So there's this whole, more Libyan, Fatah-inspired third worldist thing going on. In contrast, you have people like Motashami-Pour and others who have a similar response to the Palestinian camps that Abdullah Azzam did, as Yoav told us. These guys are not real Muslims. They're drinking, they're smoking, they have all this Marxist shit lying around. Like, what is this? This has nothing to do with 12er Shi'ism as we understand this, and predictably figures like Motashami-Pour kind of are willing to jump into bed with the Assad regime in spite of all of its problems as a preferred interlocutor for influence in the Levant. So I would say that this, third worldist moment declines in the early 1980s. Montazeri and al-Husseini are assassinated in, I think, both in 1981, if I'm not mistaken. PLO is obviously decapitated in 82. And so you're left with a more kind of black Shi'ism over the course of the 1980s. But I think one thing that has jumped out to me in a lot of my research and reading is even if you go well into the 1980s, you can find Iranian periodicals, including those that the Islamic Republic produced in Arabic, stating in very, very clear terms, like, we love Sayyid Qutb, we love what's his name? I think Abdul Hamid Keshk, this Egyptian Islamist preacher, saying, look, Saudi Arabia has nothing to do with this Muslim Brotherhood legacy. If you want to find a Sayyid Qutb street, you can find it in Tehran, not in Riyadh. So we are the legitimate inheritors of this as well. So I think this kind of fusion of the third worldism, but then the, cultural or ideological appropriation of the Muslim Brotherhood legacy is part of the story I'm trying to tell. For Cyrus, what about the many? Very, very good question. I think I'm very self-conscious and try to be explicit in making clear how this is a story of how sort of a small but dedicated kind of group of people can nonetheless change events. Maybe not in this article, but I think elsewhere I point out that until, at least if we look at the Iranian context, until probably the 1960s or 1970s, most Islamist parties were, smaller than the total number of people in this room. I think when the Islamic Nations Party was captured and dissolved, I think the name of the book is Un Pinjao Panch Nafar. It was, I'm not sure we have 55 people here, but Islamist parties were definitely not mass organizations in the late 50s and early 60s, and that's precisely why they were really fascinated with Nasserism and Egyptian politics as sort of a mass option. I think the way I would answer your question is maybe to double back to the question about that Chris posed. Is it seems to me that a lot of these guys are working uphill in the 1950s and 1960s because there is still a certain amount of goodwill towards the United States as a kind of paladin for religious interests through the examples that you cited. But then by the late 1960s, something starts to change. Obviously 67, they've mentioned 69, and so on. And it seems by the 1970s onwards, these guys have a bit more goodwill on their side that they can push. But certainly I know that when Khomeini arrived in Najaf in, I believe it was 65, there was an initial attempt at dialogue between him and the Islamic Call Party, but one of the main objections came from Islamic Call and saying, like, look, the Shah is like the most anti-communist person in the entire region. Like, he's probably killed more communists than anybody in the Middle East. Why are you so opposed to the Shah? Communism is really the enemy. And that argument lands in 1965 survive in a way that it doesn't land or can't land maybe 10 years later. So I think that this question of declining U.S. soft power perhaps in the 1960s is a question of how the few eventually have more of a tailwind and then headwind.
Thank you, Cyrus. I guess my short answer is no. I mean, partly to back up a little bit, I think about primacy a little differently. I mean, for me, primacy is very much, it's not only, but it's very much about capabilities. The military and economic resources that are at the disposal of a particular country. And that disparity exists whether both sides are selling arms or not. Primacy, I want to keep influence as a separate possibility. And so I don't see it as a competition of equals. I think the Soviets are highly relevant, and like the people who have been dealt the worst hand, they find creative, like the Iranians do. They find creative ways to use the tools at their disposal that can try to equalize in terms of influence. But fundamentally, no. I don't think the fact that the Soviets are able to sell arms pushes back that much against the notion that the capabilities between the parties are fundamentally, in terms of power capabilities, are fundamentally unequal. And I would add, and you may or may not accept this experiment, but I would add that the way the Cold War unfolds in the region itself offers us a test of your argument, and it doesn't pass, right? Which is that the Soviets by the mid-1960s are selling a lot of arms, and then just a few years later they're completely marginalized. It doesn't work to put them on some kind of equal platform. Maybe they think they have some influence for a short period, but it ultimately doesn't change the fundamentals.
Let me just quickly clarify what I meant. I didn't mean to say that this means that they have the same capacities. What I meant to say is that the sheer fact that the Soviet Union has enough military materiel that it can export and that it is willing to export basically means that the broader Cold War game that it is playing vis-à-vis the United States has an effect on the actors on the ground, because it allows Arab countries to do certain things that they otherwise might not exactly have been able to do. This is a different sort of argument than the one about I don't mean to say that they had, for this reason, the same sort of influence and capacity, which is interesting in its own right that this is the case, right? I should also perhaps note that, sheer non-nuclear military might was, of course, certainly actually from 46, 47 onwards in Europe, the one dimension where the United States was convinced, and the Soviet Union itself as well, that they have superiority. Hence, by the 1950s, the Eisenhower's new look, basically the development of much more nuclear arms, because they thought that this is the only way they will be able to stop a Soviet land invasion against Western Europe, right? So this was the argument, right? The argument is not, it gives them the same sort of capacity that the US has, the same sort of political pull that the US has, but it allows local state actors, e.g. Egypt, etc., Syria, to do certain things and to maybe also think that they can do certain things like in 67 that they otherwise wouldn't have. That's the argument.
I guess I still just don't see that as much in I feel like they're 2 points. They're both true. They're two kind of separate points. And I take your point of the new look in the 50s, and I guess I'd throw back the 70s and especially the 80s with CENTCOM, which is by the time that absolutely in Europe, but by that time the United States has demonstrated that it's also about power projection. And the technology that the U.S. has to do that. So I take your point. Maybe we can talk about whether it's in dialogue or whether there are 2 points kind of going on simultaneously.